morning. On behalf of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, it is our pleasure to have hosted the film Fruits of Labor and welcome the filmmaker Emily Cohen Ibañez. We are honored to have her here. I've known Emily for a number of years, as I was telling folks earlier on in the film, and we were both on a Fulbright and met each other. I think it was in Ecuador on one of the, they were bringing all the Fulbrighters together, and it was a really wonderful meeting, and to know that we were coming back to New York together. So, and that's an untold number of years ago. So it's very exciting to see and have followed Emily's career and the works that she's done. And I'm so excited to have this film. I think it's an incredible piece that has us reflect on labor in the United States. And, you know, it's just thinking we're here at this moment of graduation for so many students, especially for our CUNY professors here who are working with first generation students. You know, this is, I imagine, especially poignant as well as we see them kind of accomplish this next stage in their education. Without further ado, we've invited Professor Ismael García Colón of the CUNY Graduate Center and his College of Staten Island to be a commentator in conversation with Emily. In lieu of reading the kind of many accolades that both of these scholars have, I'm going to post that in the chat because I want to kind of bring us into the conversation very quickly. We're going to invite Ismael to begin with some of his comments and then pose those questions to Emily, and then we will open up the floor to Q&A. You can post them in the chat. If there's something that's been brewing in your mind as you watch the film, please go ahead and put those. I mean, I have a couple of comments and questions that I'd also like to drop in the chat as well. And I don't want, I could take over this conversation, as a good professor will sometimes get carried away with words. So I will invite Professor Colón, García Colón, to begin the conversation. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. Most citizens in this country do not pause to think about the importance of farm workers for the production, processing, and distribution of food. Watching Fruits of Labor reminded me that in my New York City neighborhood of Jackson Heights, it's really easy to find fruit vendors selling California strawberries during the summer, which many people complain when they become expensive. It also reminded me of my ethnographic field work in southern New Jersey during the harvest season. Sometimes temperatures reached 100 degrees, bringing exhaustion to workers in the field. Farm workers work 12 hours a day, sometimes 7 days a week. And in my classes, I point out to the difficulty of farm work and how few citizens are willing to do that kind of job in the United States. And I often joke about how I could not last more than half an hour bending my back and working under extremely hot weather, working under the sun and with insect biting all of your body is not fun. And especially it's not fun for teenagers that have to work doing this task. Like Fruits of Labor, we need to highlight the connections that the public in the United States don't make between their food and farm workers. In the COVID-19 spring of 2020, some of the vulnerabilities in the political economy of US farm production brought to light some of the contradictions of the food supply system. All of the sudden, farm workers became essential workers in the United States. Every time that the United States faces a risk of food insecurity, farm workers become important, but at what cost? For example, the Trump administration proposed the reduction of wages to guest workers. Guest workers are temporary migrant farm workers. And this happened in the middle of the pandemic. Food productions involves the alienation, dispossession, and disposability of people. But it's also shaped by people's hopes and dreams of improving their standard of living. Precisely, this film explores the challenges faced by poor immigrant undocumented workers and youth and women. And we can see this right through Ashley's aspirations and anxieties. One of the most important contributions of Fruits of Labor, at least in my opinion, is that it documents the intersection of objective political economic conditions and power relations with the subjective context of people's attempt to transform their existing conditions of life. For elected and government officials, farmers and agribusinesses, actually could just be another statistics. Ashley is part of the approximately 32% of female farm workers, the 65% of farm workers who identify as Mexican, and the 7% of teenagers who work in agriculture. Her story also explained the barriers to education faced by teenagers that work in agriculture. Only 30% of farm workers have completed 10 to 12 years of a school in the United States. Ashley and her siblings are the product of the policies of free trade and neoliberalism that have achieved this globalized, flexible accumulation of capital. These processes have increased diverse forms of dispossessions that accelerate the migration of Mexican women to the United States, and we can see the effects of this in this film. But I just want to talk about two important topics that the film addresses directly and indirectly. We can talk about many topics that this film speaks about. The first, farm workers as a cheap labor force. Cheap food requires cheap labor. How do social forces construct a cheap labor force? Fruits of Labor shows the environment of fear experienced by families with undocumented parents. Undocumented workers in agriculture and the service sectors occupy a position of extreme vulnerability in a labor regime in which employers benefit by offering low wages. Employers also take advantage of workers who can be deported. Fear of being deported is part of the way in which food could be produced at lower cost in the United States. And this is something that people ignore or they simply don't make the connection. Fear, workers' vulnerabilities are obstacles for labor organizing in the workplace. US distributors of food, farmers and agribusinesses rely on disorganized workers. They also rely on government subsidies and tax breaks and the efforts of the families and the support of the communities where these workers live or migrate from. Cheap food also requires the lack of legal protections for overtime pay and minimum wage. As a second generation, Ashley, like many other children of immigrants in the United States, works in the farming not only because she needs to help her family economically, but because laws and the lack of a safety net against child labor allows it. This is part of how workers are made into cheap labor. In other words, how labor forces are constructed with people perceived by society as unskilled labor, and therefore, again, cheap labor. Unskilled jobs tend to be occupied usually by women, children, and the poor. What constitutes unskilled work is also very subjective. There is nothing unskilled about picking strawberries in a way that workers could make a living wage. Remember, we learned from the film that Ashley offers to take her brother to the fields and teach him to harvest strawberries. You have to learn to harvest strawberries quickly and without damaging the plants and the strawberries themselves, right? Like you need to know how to cut a lettuce fast without damaging the lettuce. So I question this naming of farm work as unskilled labor. The second topic that I want to emphasize, it is the long history of labor migration between Mexico and the United States. The film indirectly deals with the deep roots of Mexican labor in the United States. Why are Mexicans the majority of farm workers in the United States? During the 19th century, US imperialism and the colonization of the Southwest depended on Mexican labor. In the 20th century, the creation of several initiatives for Mexican guest workers in agriculture created a permanent migratory infrastructure in places like California. Although limited and temporary, the US federal government created the first Mexican bracero program during the First World War. When World War II broke out, the federal government also instituted another guest worker program with Mexico for farm workers. Most of the labor shortages that happened during the Second War, the First War, and also the Korean War were actually the result of the reluctance of war-related industries and growers to pay higher wages. After the war, the US government allowed the continuation of the Mexican bracero program during the 1940s, late 1940s, 1950s, and early 1960s. And it ended the program in 1964. And when it was eliminated, this fostered undocumented migration to the United States. By the 1990s, with the enactment of NAFTA, undocumented migration from Mexico reached enormous levels. And this film, what we see in this film is are the effects of this labor policies of guest work in the United States. To conclude, farm workers and their families are not simple victims, but social actors maneuvering for their survival under a regime of inequality. Ashley's project of the juice growing justice and the creation of this community garden also reveals the contradiction of a system of production, processing, and distribution of food that maintains their workers living under conditions of hunger. Lack of access to food is part of the problem of also of other lack of, for example, of housing and living in crowded housing, the workers. Experiencing poverty does not mean one is poor in a spirit, hopes, and aspirations. Ashley's goals are nurtured by her faith spirituality, and a strong identification with her heritage. Fruits of Labor offers a powerful case for scholars interested in youth, child labor, Latinx in the United States, and US farm labor. It is an excellent resource to teach about inequality and the dreams of Latinx youth in the United States. So I have tons of questions for the filmmaker, but let me just only ask her 3 principal questions. I want to know, what was your goal for making the film, and why Ashley? How did you decide that you were going to make this film with her? The second question is, how was the process involving researching and conducting the interviews? Was it challenging for Ashley to discuss these issues with you? And the third question is, do you think that your training as an anthropologist provided or influenced the way that you made this film? And thank you for bringing us this film and this story.
First, I just want to say, wow, this is really an honor to be here. And there's been so many beautiful words said, and I really appreciate it. As an independent filmmaker, it's really wonderful to see people responding to the work in this way. With Victoria, when I got the message from her and the invite, I was so excited because, as she was saying, many years ago, we were Fulbrighters together. I was doing research in Colombia. She was in Ecuador. And so it's just really wonderful. And we've seen each other in our career trajectories. And then Ismael, wow, like when I was invited to this, I looked into your research, which is fascinating, about Puerto Rican workers, which is often an under-recognized, untold history, as a part of labor, and thinking through kind of the complexity of identities and where we all fit as different Latinx identities, right? And on that, sort of being the, forever stranger in your homeland kind of thing. And so this was just really amazing. So just thank you so much. And of course, Lydia, awesome. You did like the tech really well. Not everyone does that. So it's really nice. So yeah, my goal, so I'd done my undergraduate in the 90s at UC Santa Cruz. And this takes place in Santa Cruz County in a town called Watsonville. During the making of it, we hadn't mentioned the town, but legal situation for Ashley's mom has changed, and the town's really excited. Tomorrow we're doing a huge screening in the plaza, in the city plaza. So there's a lot of town pride around this film. And I'd done in the 90s work with United Farm Workers. I was an undergraduate doing kind of liaison work with United Farm Workers and on campus. And there was a big strawberry strike. It's sort of somehow been this blip or amnesia around this. But, when we were in it, felt very big. And we had, a 10,000 person march, a huge strike. Arturo Rodriguez was the president at the time. He came to the university and spoke. We organized that. We organized a panel of women farm workers talking about sexual harassment. So they were demanding there be more protections for them in the workplace. Really the only real demand that we won was to ban the use of methyl bromide, which is a horrible pesticide. Working in the town, and later I was doing HIV/AIDS prevention work, and after college worked in Watsonville. I used to get bloody noses just, for my office. The pesticide wafts in, kids in the elementary schools. There's still pesticide use, but I have to say in the 90s, people they would spray right on the workers, even though that wasn't legal. People would have welts on their arms. It's very toxic. And what a lot of people don't realize with strawberries, it requires a lot. It's a labor intensive fruit. It's probably the most labor intensive agricultural product we have. So it's sort of America's favorite berry, but their most kind of use of pesticides. to keep a strawberry from not being affected by bugs, by rot, by all these different things in the environment, there's a lot that goes into it. So not only the picking, but there's the weeding and the planting and the preparing of the soil and pesticide use and all of that go into this production. So, I'd done that work, I'd been committed to it. I moved to New York. I actually did my doctorate at NYU in anthropology and taught in the CUNY system at LaGuardia. So very proud, and I love the CUNY system. I was really inspired with my students and the kind of opportunities that CUNY gives, and really wonderful student body, my favorite, really, to be honest, that I've been in the classroom with. And then I returned. I was helping direct, I was an assistant director of a research institute at UCSC. And I returned, after living 12 years in New York, because I have family both in Santa Cruz and Arizona. And so I wanted to return. And I started doing work in Watsonville again. And my sister works in food justice and was just starting a project in Watsonville. And I had said, okay, Rose, I'm teaching visual sociology. I have these 8 college students in a lab. Why don't we do collaborative work? Because I just love doing work in Watsonville. And so with this group of youth that Ashley described as Youth Growing Justice, we did a collaborative, so I'm really interested in different ways of authoring films or any kind of art production. So we made a video collective called the River Park Garden Video Collective. And the students collaborated with the youth in making a community film. It was like a 20-minute film about their garden. And Ashley was one of these young people, and she really stood out. I mean, she was more quiet at the time. I do camera work, and she was really drawn to the camera, and I was very impressed with her. And also, that she not only was really, wanted better things for herself at a very young age at 14, 15, but had this consciousness about the community. And that was impressive and was really just engaged. So I got to know her, kept doing arts development work with the youth, even after I left UCSC, and have got to know her family over the years. And then 2016 election happens. And so I'm a freelancer, and one of my side gigs, I work as a video journalist for different outlets. I was seeing in the the narrative, the dominant narrative in news media around the election was Trump had been elected because there was a white male working class in rural America that had felt alienated. Now, that wasn't what I had observed and experienced in my life and in my work. And in California, a lot of our rural areas are actually brown, and working people, many are Latinos and people of color. And this is rural America too. Watsonville is part of rural America. And I think that is the case actually throughout. And if you look at statistically, even among the working class, there's high numbers of people of color within the working class and working poor. So there was something wrong with the narrative. The other thing that I was seeing is, rightly so, there was a lot of attention brought to what was happening in the US-Mexico border around family separation. And we saw these young children and babies in cages. Now that needed exposure. And I mean, I wish there was more and more outrage, to be honest. But what I wasn't seeing are the stories of how the border travels. What Trump, in a lot of the policy changes, the border exists 100 miles from any coastline of the United States, which means then, even though in Santa Cruz or in Watsonville, we're, it's an 8-hour drive to the border, we're farther from the border. We're still in a borderland because we're on the coastline and any 100 miles in from that. And so what that happens is ever since George Bush, after 9/11 started ICE, we haven't always had ICE. We've had these kinds of raids on workplaces, but with Trump, the discourse, as well as the actual raids happening in the community, had increased. So in Santa Cruz County, you were seeing these kind of busts going into neighborhoods, and they would just round people up. So even, let's say you weren't even on a list or didn't do anything wrong or whatever, you would get pulled in the sweep because if you didn't have papers. Factories, and especially the fields, were being targeted. So what was happening at that moment, and this is before kind of the H-2A gets in motion again, there was a major labor gap. And so when I actually did meet with some growers to be able to get access to the fields, and what their perspective was, look, it's legal to hire children. These are children born in the United States. And so there's a major labor gap. We'll hire them, and a lot of them had experience already in the fields. But what was impressive to me was all the young people I was working with, many of them, their parents were farm workers, but they weren't actually working in the fields. After the election, they all went to work in the fields, all of them, the whole group of youth. And some of them were really small, they're kids. And so I thought, wow, this is a story that's not being told. So that was one goal, to interrupt that dominant narrative and the untold aspects of this labor. What was happening? Is it that we do deportations and then the white, angry, male, working class comes and fills those jobs, or something else happening? And we weren't hearing what actually was happening as a result of the deportations. So that was part of the motivation. The other being, I love teen movies. I'm a filmmaker, so I love movies. And I love coming of age stories. They are just sort of like, I enjoy pop culture. So it's an American genre that many of us enjoy, and it's a classic genre. The thing is, I don't see it, rarely is it afforded to women of color and working women. Usually it's young white boys, that come of age in these American films. So, a lot of it was, I wanted to make a film that I actually wanted to watch. And Ashley, she had stood out to me. She's this young, bright, beautiful woman. She was entering her last year of high school. It has kind of this natural arc to it. She's working in the fields. She's doing this night shift in the factory. So she has all these struggles, and she's an intelligent woman, young woman, who we get to see come of age. And I find her very charming, and I don't know, like her family, there's sort of the love just jumps off the screen, and they're lovely to work with. And to make a film like this, really focused on the family, so that you get all these intersecting issues and stories, how that actually plays out in the family system, the family dynamic. A lot of trust needs to be there. And so I trusted Ashley, and Ashley trusted me, and the same happened with the family. And so really these have to be joint ventures. And Ashley's very brave, because in terms of, is it challenging? Ashley talks about, because we, talk at different festivals or different screenings, we'll discuss, how, and I didn't even totally perceive her nervousness, but that she was very nervous. But that she thought, well, you know what, this is something that is important for my community. She also felt very lonely at the time, and here's this filmmaker who's going to follow her around and be kind of a witness to her life's anxieties and turmoils and ups and downs. And so there's sort of that mix, of things, but also thinking, you know what, this story matters. And I want to share it because it's not just me. And one of Ashley's big messages, especially in our impact campaign, when we talk with the communities, is she's like, her biggest thing is she wants people to come away with is, we are not alone. There's many of us that have gone through what I went through. And there's a real power in that. And so, Yeah, and we can get more into the way also we did collaboration, which I think builds a lot of trust and goes into, I'm sort of going down your questions, goes into my training as an anthropologist. So what's really interesting is so I've shifted into the film industry. Like I don't really work in academia anymore. So I work within the industry. And within the industry, there, especially within journalism, there's an idea that you don't collaborate in that way with what are called subjects. People still are using the term. Now it's shifting, but because that compromises objectivity, and journalism, and a lot of very good journalism, and I think it's situational. So I'll get into that because you know, I do believe in journalism and its search for truth. But for this particular film, to me, there is a deeper truth. And I look a lot at poetics. And that, I think, comes from my anthropology training. Also, I was really influenced as a graduate student by Jean Rouch. He was a filmmaker, anthropologist from the 60s, who actually, my understanding of the history, so it's so interesting because people in the industry, we all come from, a lot of people come from art schools. I didn't come from an art school. I came from more anthropology, visual anthropology. And my understanding of verite and that term that was coined, cinema verite being cinema truth, coming from Rouch, and it at its very core, collaborations at its very core. So if you don't know about Rouch, he, worked in Western Africa. He collaborated with the people very deeply that are in his films. There's really interesting films where the image is rolling and, him and the folks in the film, and he's often in the film himself, are like having discussions about what is, so it's like a meta discussion of what is happening on screen. And there's a lot of humor and fun and kind of pointing back at anthropology and its colonial history. And so for me, having that training, I'm interested in disrupting the colonial, what I believe is a colonial history, not only in anthropology, but in the documentary film history as well. That I think that they're actually very interlinked. And you see the changes if you look at art, if you look at approaches to ethnography, even there's, from early, oh my gosh, the British, they go to the Torres Straits. What's his name? Oh, I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, old, kind of anthropology that there was these original, and you can find these online, kind of films where they would do documentation, but in these sort of categories like native, islander, dancing. And so they keep the camera on a tripod and you categorize that activity. Native, climbing up a tree, all this. So they felt at that time it was very important to capture these behaviors and have them as, kind of representation. Then you start seeing, and things, start shifting in perspective. So from ethnography to then when you're seeing shifts in film and art like Picasso and this idea of multi-perspectives, you start seeing shifts in ethnographic film, you see the shifts in the documentary field, you see shifts in discussions within the visual arts. So it's really interesting how there is sort of a trajectory to the styles and approaches that we take. So that always interests me. And I like to be thoughtful about it in the very process of making the films I make myself. So my way of doing collaboration was for this particular film to bring Ashley on as a co-writer. And it was great because what we did was, I was doing some observational filming her, following her. But then we go and I worked with an editor and we'd have edited sequences. And then I luckily started getting grants. And so I could afford to pay for Ashley and I to be, once we were at a bed and breakfast, another time she stayed a week at my house, and, and pay, also that the no is that like I had her on the line item budgets of the production, and she's been paid throughout. But the way I divided that, I mean, this is more gets interesting for industry people who might want to do it in the future, but is I employed her when she was a writer as a part of an artist. And she's able now to get artist relief grants, because she is a writer on this with me. And so anyway, so that's how I kind of divided, like, oh, the observational, it's not being paid, but then, and we have these questions in anthropology ourselves around power and money exchange. So these are all, and they should always be questioned. But anyway, she came on as a part of the creative team. And we would do these week-long things, watch the sequences together. We would discuss Brecht. One of my favorite books when I used to teach intro to anthropology, I always started with Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. So that book really influenced the structure for this film for me. So we would do different readings. We'd watch other documentaries. And then we'd have kind of a meta discussion of what we were seeing her life. So it's really interesting. She said for her, it was like her life was always moving so fast to solve problems and survive, that having these discussions helped her reflect on her own life. And she found it actually very healing. She always talks about it was very healing for her and helped her move forward and make certain choices and help find certain solutions. Now she's going to be transferring to a 4-year college. She wants to be a businesswoman, entrepreneur, a social entrepreneur. We can talk a little bit about that, which is very cool. So yeah, then I would give her some keywords. I would leave the room. So I'd have her watch a scene, give keywords, leave the room, and she would just write. And she had told me, I'm not a good writer. I get bad grades in English. I said, nonsense. Everybody can learn to write. Maybe we're not going to be Emily Dickinson, but we can all learn to write. And when you write from your own experience, you'd be impressed. I think I've always found when you start there, the writing improves greatly, and it can be a real stepping stone to then maybe go back and do other kinds of writing. And just pages and pages and pages were coming out. She's like, I am a writer. And so then we'd look at the prose, and I'd help her hone that so it could match the film and follow a narrative arc. And so we worked together to create that narration, and there was many revisions. We recorded it many times. She's not a trained actress, so to get a better delivery of the narration, we worked with Teatro Campesino, which is a local theater here that's had international acclaim. They started in the 60s with the United Farm Workers movement. It was a street theater. They did these theater things called Patron, Patroncito, Big Boss, Little Boss. And really the messages of these street theater was, most foremen on the field, the field is really a factory. So most of the foremen actually were workers themselves, and they're always men, by the way. But so Patron Patroncito was saying, don't become a foreman, join the union. That was kind of, and then now they have here very close to Watsonville, they have their theater house. We had gone to see theater, and my student interns were all first-gen students. So it was all about creating a pipeline of mentorship in the film, from every aspect of building the team to the way I worked with Ashley. And then with Teatro, we worked with an actress who I'd done work with before, teaching narrative writing to high school students, Latino high school students. And so she collaborated with us to do a workshop. And really, actors have really wonderful techniques on controlling breath, on how to connect emotion to words. It's great for public speaking, for anything, really wonderful activities that Ashley and I could practice together, as I'd be recording her. So yeah, those were we did many different things to allow Ashley to dig deep into her emotions, to allow herself to step back and reflect on her life, because sometimes that's hard when you're just trying to survive. And we even had, she goes regularly to a curandera. We had a curandera come and do ceremony at the end of one of our sessions that we were doing. You see the more theatrical stage, you know, what I call the black box. So some work that was really difficult and very emotional, we kind of cleansed the space and afterwards. And so we did a lot of different modalities, and we came up with different modalities together in collaboration with other collaborators. And for me, you know, my executive producers, you know, a lot of times in film, it's money, that's what it means. But for me, I wanted mentors. So like, especially Aurora Guerrero and Rick Perez, they were my mentors, and they came on, their role was as mentors for me as I was kind of getting out in the industry for the first time. And then I could mentor my interns, and they could mentor Ashley, you know, so, and it kind of keeps going. Now we have youth ambassadors in our impact campaign. So I've been talking a lot, but yes, all those, that's kind of circling back to anthropology and my own ideas of what in the industry called accountability, you know, is informed in the making of the film.
Thank you, Emily. I mean, so many fascinating points, and thank you, Ismael, for such a, you know, threading through of all the different ways we saw those intersections in Ashley's life. And so I wanted to, I know we have kind of a smaller group here now. If there's anybody who wants to pose a question, you can certainly raise your hand, or a comment, or any kind of reflection that you might have. I know sometimes it's hard to kind of reflect or pose a question or compose a question immediately after seeing the film. Sometimes you have to let it kind of simmer a bit and then kind of think about what really jumped out at you. And so maybe I'll just jump in. I was very struck by how nature was a protagonist in a way in the cinematography of this. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that choice.
Yeah, so, well, one, it's a sort of a through line to the film work that I make, is really looking at people's relationships to plants and to the natural world, and humans as being a part of that ecosystem. So that's an interest. But what was great, I think one of the bonding aspects between Ashley and I was her appreciation for nature. And so that was something I really wanted to bring out. I mean, I think that for me, and it's important, there's some excellent films that are more expose style. But for me, sometimes what can happen is that people of color become kind of stand-ins for a social problem. And I was really interested in Ashley being a full person on the screen, and through everything, she's a teenager, she, you know, all the different aspects of who she is as a full person. And so those reflections, her reflections on nature, were very important for me to incorporate. Also, it added another layer to, you know, the work of farm labor has been denigrated in our country, and I would say globally. And a lot of that, at least within the Americas, is its connection to slavery. In slavery, people were deemed as less than full human persons. And so then we became to associate work and land on the work on the land as, oh, well, people who work the land are somehow then less than full human persons. And so going back to Ismael's comment about skill, it absolutely is skilled labor. And not only is that, it's probably one of the absolute most important labor that can be conducted, because we all eat. We're all connected to the story. If they don't work, we don't eat, you know, like, so, and I would add, yes, part of it, the motivation of people not wanting to pay more for food, but I have to say, we need to look at where the money is, because it's a very wealthy industry. The strawberry business alone is a multi-billion-dollar industry in California, okay? And then they've taken the same companies, and I'm not allowed to say the name because I legally signed something, but it's hard to figure it out. They're in Mexico. They've moved to Mexico because that now, you know, the more people fight for make demands here, then they go to Mexico, and then you get the H-2A, and there's all these ways it keeps moving and moving to keep that labor force down. But the capacity is there. without even raising prices on your own box of strawberry. It's that level on the top. If you look at the pyramid of what people are making piecemeal on a box of strawberry compared to what the growers and the distributors are making, it's mile, it's huge disparity. So it is a multi-billion-dollar business. People are very, very wealthy in this business. It's just not going to the workers and the people doing the work on the ground. So that, yeah, I mean, I think that, and then there's, I'm doing other film work where it's really about valuing this kind of labor, valuing nature and all of its, oftentimes nature is related to feminine, related to something that needs to be controlled. And oftentimes we see in Western depictions of nature, it's man against nature. And in Fruits of Labor, I wanted nature to be a friend, because nature truly is a friend to Ashley, and nature's a friend to me. It's the way I can survive in the world, is I meditate often on nature and do very long walks through nature. So yeah, that was sort of that tying that in. It was true to Ashley, and it's something that I definitely like to focus on in my work.
Great. I wanted to actually open the floor. I think Professor Julie Skursky had posed a question. I think something with our chat module isn't allowing it to post to everyone, but Julie, would you like to pose the question? Okay, there she is. Hi.
Hi, Victoria.
Hi.
And Ismael. And well, I think first off, I just wanted to thank you for this really powerful and beautiful film. And it does an amazing job of really, I think, capturing the perspective of young people living through this, which is what we often don't get, even from, an approach that I really value, which is a political economic approach, but it oftentimes doesn't fully capture what people are living through and bringing to this. So, but I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the importance of the curanderos, because at the beginning she said, or I'm not sure who said it, but that her relatives or ancestors were curanderos, and now in your comments you mentioned the presence of curanderos, and I was just wondering in what ways you see either them affecting her thinking or her mother's, and perhaps her development of the garden, and also how that kind of knowledge is also part of what's being lost through this homogenizing force of industrial agriculture, which simplifies and not only mechanizes things and labor, but also really expunges a more complex form of knowledge.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. That's, yeah. So Ashley's background, so Ashley identifies as indigenous Totonac from Mexico, mainly, yeah, and mestiza and Chicana. And both of her grandmothers were curanderas. Ashley talks about one being seen as more of a healer and one doing things that weren't, revenge and doing things that weren't as helpful or healing, So she says there's different forms of magic, and one grandmother who was more in the healing end of things, and one grandmother who could produce revenge at the service for people. So for her, and in the community, there's really rich indigenous knowledge that happens in that garden. So a lot of the elders are teaching the young people how to grow food in a different manner. So there is industrial monoculture that you saw in the fields, where it's like all just rows and rows and rows of strawberries. But then in the garden, you see like planting looks almost a little more chaotic, but actually there is a method to the madness of accompanying plants. You can put plants next to each other that protect from, you could do, or they know how to do organic farming through the smaller scale and planting plants, arranging them in a different kind of order, and mixing the, I guess you could say, species or food products, right, that they're growing. So there's knowledge there. Her family's deeply religious and spiritual. It's really interesting. The curandera, I had wanted her to come out in the film. She's also, how would you say? I don't know if it's attacked or kind of demonized in the community. Ashley also belongs to an evangelical church. So none of those things really came to the fore because there is a conflict there. So a lot of folks in the community go to curanderas. Even in the 90s, I mean, they were part of when we were doing the farm working organizing, because you can go for many things, anxiety, and they tend to be women healers, and they have their own set of knowledge. But the evangelical church in the community is also very strong and doesn't like their church members to go to what they see as like a black magic or a problem. So she didn't, I said, we could even cover your face, and, we could do it, shoot it in all these different ways, but she was worried about that. So she, and then we decided to kind of exclude the church as well, because Ashley had a conflictive relationship at that moment. And so, but what we were able to do through Ashley was represent her own complex layered belief system, where she's both a Christian and someone who is proud of Indigenous spirituality and knowledge. And those things can coexist very easily in a person, right? They don't have to be these opposing forces. So it was more to center her in that point of view. And I was really interested in centering the mother and daughter relationship. And a lot of those things could unfold naturally in the way that they speak to each other. I mean, her mom often makes references to God, and that being very important, and a way to carve out a space for hope in one's life. And so I think for the Pavone family, that's really important. So I just allowed it to emerge naturally in their conversation and then come out in the narration as Ashley was telling me. And I was really fascinated too. So, I'd be asking more questions about it.
Thank you so much. Can I just ask you, I don't know if I missed it, because you've referred to them as, you've referred to this as Indigenous knowledge. And so I'm not clear what part of Mexico they come from. And do they identify in some specific way as Indigenous, or are you drawing this out?
So they do. So Ashley identifies as Totonac. On her paternal side, they speak Nahuatl. They're originally from Veracruz. So that's kind of what, I've really just taken from her perspective and what she has told me, rather than creating some kind of separate research around that. So it was really to be centered in kind of the way she identifies herself and sees herself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for your questions. I'm wondering if anybody has other questions. I know, Ismael, you might have a few more. You did mention in the beginning you had a few more that you'd like to ask, and I don't want to kind of roll into the conversation with the additional ones for myself. But I could see if Wendy or Kimberly are interested in posing. You can drop it in the chat. I think you now can put it in for everybody. But Ismael, did you have any kind of other things that came up after Emily's response to your questions?
I mean, something that I didn't mention is more a kind of a comment than question is our gender relations. And I think Emily is really good at showing us how gender relations played out in her family. And especially because Ashley, right, she's a teenager, she has all these dreams, and which are different from the dreams and attitudes that her brother have. And I'm really interested about the now for Ashley. And you mentioned that she wants to be a social entrepreneur. But I would like to know more about what is going on in her in her life now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm so glad you brought up, well, gender for me, that in terms of goals, that's why I wanted to focus on the family, because for women, I don't think you can look at work relations without looking also at the home. And so that's really why I decided to point the camera in those areas. And yes, and Ashford is a lovely young man. He's grown a lot. I was very worried about the fact that, I'm like, oh, it's very juicy. It's very, all the things. But then I thought, my God, before the world premiere we had at South by Southwest, I then had the family, we went to the Roxy movie theater in San Francisco, and we did a whole red carpet because it's COVID, we couldn't do that in-person experience. And so decided to kind of recreate that. And also I wanted the family to see the final product, because Ashley was really in there with me, but it's her perspective. Her family wasn't as involved in terms of seeing what the final product was. So I was very nervous about how Ashford would react. After the screening, he came up to me and said, "It's very good. It's excellent. It's excellent." So then I was like, okay, that's good. And then Ashley told me later they got in a heated discussion. And he's like, "Why did you guys?" But then, since then, she said she's from her perspective, it helped him the most, because now he's in our Watsonville screening tomorrow. He's going to talk to young men, because he now can talk, like we talk and he talks openly. He's like, yeah, like he was like 16-year-old boy in a society that kind of says, boys are allowed to play more, there's less restrictive life, whatever, that's the messaging in our broader society, right? And young people absorb that. I mean, we all participate in that. And so anyway, he's like, now looking back, I was like, oh my gosh, I was reproducing kind of sexism, in my family. And so since they now live together, they have a really nice apartment. So he's working at Tesla and doing a Cabrillo. There's a community college here where you can get trained, and it's a good paying job at Tesla. So it's a collaboration between Tesla and the community college to be trained in I think it's like it's sort of an engineering position that you could do with an associate's, and it's paid well. So he's very happy about that. And then she's finishing up her associates, and she's, now she's employed. So she works kind of for my film company, either as a field producer when I'm doing these shorts for news agencies, but also for our impact campaign, she's a speaker. And so it's great because now she can be a full-time student and then can earn the income in an easier way, and it's something that she finds meaningful for herself. And that's the kind of idea, because I think there's nothing wrong with field work. It just needs to be valued more, but it's more that people have choices. We all should have the right to pursue something that's meaningful to ourselves. And so that's more the point. Ashley actually loves growing food. And what she wants to do is create her own. She's saving her money to purchase 1 or 2 acres of land. So she's studying business and wants to start her own strawberry farm with equitable pay that changes the entire work structure. And so that workers get fair pay, they have scholarships to go to higher education. Because that was one of the things the Strawberry Commission in Watsonville says, that they offer scholarships. So I was like helping her. I'm like, let's do this for like college, like, whatever, let's take their money. And in the end they said no, because since she was semi working under the table, they said, you don't have the documentation. I said, look, I have a document of all this footage. I can show you she worked in the fields. No, they wouldn't give her this. And most people don't have that level of documentation. At the way that employment happens, it's almost like when you're at Home Depot and to pick up day labor, there's a foreman who gathers people. It's not like so official. So anyway, the idea she wants then from that experience, she's like, I want there to be a pathway to higher education in my field. And that also workers aren't allowed to eat strawberries. They dock her pay, she'd get punished. So she wants it to be that workers can actually eat their strawberries. So anyway, she's looking into hydroponics, so you don't have to bend over. With hydroponics, you can stand while you're picking, which is much better and a much better environment. You could be protected a little better from the sun. Heat exhaustion is one of the #1 killer of farm workers. And now with climate change, like I've done work with vineyard workers when I do work for the Intercept, and that, you know, with wildfires, I mean, they're making all these demands, but they, you know, workers are saying even from 5 years ago with the wildfires and the increase in heat, I mean, asthma, heat exhaustion, actually, you know, people faint and, you know, in the middle of the fields all the time, and the foreman keeps them working. So these are all things that she wants to address and show that you can make a farm business that is actually not exploiting workers in that way, but like has pathways to opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, that's very instructive, right, of what she wants to do, and basically what we observe in the film and how she wants to change those conditions.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I wanted to say I put the link to the Fruits of Labor film here, so that's going to connect you to the website. But I also wanted to say that CLACLS has purchased the film for the University of CUNY to use. And so for those of you who are thinking like this would be a great tool to use in my classroom, we can. And so we need to work with the CUNY, the GC library, to add that to a digital file. And then we are happy to share that with you, because I think as this conversation has been so stimulating and rich and nuanced, as our other attendees have posted in the chat, so thank you for your comments, we really can continue this conversation. And I think this film will be well positioned to be in many different classes across CUNY, and I think certainly will resonate with students. I think this coming of age story really does it does resonate. And so I want to kind of congratulate you again, Emily, on this work. It really is a beautiful piece, and I am really happy that we're able to showcase it here tonight. And thank you, Ismael. We were so excited you agreed to comment, particularly because of the research and work that you've done. And so, you know, like this could be another conversation of how you guys see that cross-pollination and those parallels at another time in the future, perhaps. And thank you, Professor Skursky, for joining and posing your questions. I think, Lydia, did you have any comments or questions or any last reminders? Because sometimes I forget the last minute things.
No, I just want to say I really enjoyed watching the film. I have a background in journalism, so I dream of making a documentary someday. So it's just really inspiring to see the important work that you did in this film. So thank you for sharing all your knowledge and the experience of, you know, gaining the trust of the subjects in the film. It's really impressive. Thank you.
Oh, well, keep in touch. Yeah, no, I want to thank everybody, because this discussion was, you know, sometimes you just keep answering like a robot the same questions, but this was actually quite stimulating and wonderful. And just everyone here, just so thoughtful. And Ismael, I love the intro. I mean, it was really nice to have that kind of that commentary in the film. It was really interesting for me. So I enjoyed that. And yes, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Victoria, and everyone here for taking your time to watch and engage.
Oh, on that note, thank you. Bravo. Excellent film. We don't do that anymore, right? but well deserved. Congratulations again. It definitely merits all the accolades and the list keeps growing. So may it continue forward. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight. It's wonderful to see you, and we'll be in contact soon.
Sounds great.
Thank you. Bye.